Hello and you're welcome to the Big Tech Show with me, Adrian Weckler. Now, from selling Irish pubs in Italy to US multinationals in Ireland to co-founding a fintech startup here to now becoming a breakout international social media wine influencer. I'm talking today to the talented Mr. Jonathan Staunton, also known on social media as Wine List Guy, who has been named the Wine Sommelier 2025 at the Vino Influencer Global Awards in Spain. Jonathan, first of all, you're welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Adrian. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm going to get into the winefluencer ring in a couple of minutes, but you've gone from being what is to us quite a conventional business person, weaving in and out of tech, marketing, multinational startups, the kind of things that we cover and the kind of people that we regularly talk to being one of Ireland's sort of fastest growing and now European award winning wine influencers with tens of thousands of followers on social media, especially Instagram. I'm going to be asking you how you have learned to make a business out of that and what brought you to it. But first, I want you to take you back through what brought you to this point. And your first experience in business had an interesting cultural route into it, in that you left school and went to stay with your aunt and your communist city planner uncle, didn't you?
Yeah, that's right, Adrian. I suppose the first thing I should probably say for your listeners is that unlike most of your guests, I can't say that I had a very well-shaped plan from the outset, and I spent my life pursuing it at all costs.
Yeah.
I think I took the more serendipitous route. Maybe until recently, we'll come back to that. But yes, my first experience really, I think I was in Rome when I was a 1-year-old. My mum's sister had moved there. She had run away to join the ballet in Rome and married an Italian doctor who had communist tendencies, which back then was completely normal in an Italian context. He also had great connections. And so my first time out of the country as a grown-up, I got brought to 4 games of Italia 90 on my uncle's tickets.
Incredible.
So I was there in the Stadio Olimpico the night Ireland played Italy in the quarterfinal. Schillaci did it in the second half. But what was so interesting that night was I saw in person how the Italians began to understand who the Irish were. They'd maybe heard of Ireland. We really didn't have much brand recognition, I think, in a lot of European countries back then. And I think that was the beginning of it. And my first job a couple of years later very much kind of tied into that. But it was an incredible first time to be abroad. And the one thing I knew coming home as a 16-year-old about to go into the Leaving Cert the next year was that I absolutely had to get onto an Italian Erasmus program.
Yeah, because shortly after that, Irish pubs in Italy started to boom. And I think you were telling me before that more pubs were started to be built in Italy than McDonald's because of Italia 90.
And it wasn't just Italy. It was the boom in Irish culture. The first time we had something we could export. We were tapping into the Irish diaspora, most Irish pubs being open, not just across Europe, but beyond. As Irish people know when they travel today, there's nowhere that hasn't had an Irish pub reach there. And there's usually Irish people involved. Yeah. So, we were opening these Irish social embassies all over the world. And it was a global figure. We were opening more Irish pubs back in the 90s than McDonald's were opening restaurants.
Social embassies, that's a great term for it. And you ended up living in Milan for a couple of years.
I did. So I did my Erasmus. I squeaked into international commerce with Italian and did my Erasmus in Turin. I chose Turin because I'm a Liverpool fan, and with Heysel and the Liverpool-Juventus connection, I'd never lived in a major city with a major team. And I just wanted to be able to go to as many football matches as I could. And then I came back, graduated, and my first job was working for my first visionary entrepreneur boss, a man called John O'Hagan, who is still in charge of his amazing business, Specialist Joinery Group in Mahara in Northern Ireland. And he knew that there was an opportunity for him not just to be contracted to build pubs for other people. He went to Freddie Heineken in Amsterdam and said to Freddie, the average Italian doesn't know the difference between your black beer, they owned Beamish, they owned Murphy's, and Guinness. So let's do Murphy's Pubs of Ireland while there's still a chance. And so we built 5 Irish pubs in Milan in the next 18 months while I was there.
Incredible. Incredible. Now, that had to come to an end at some point. So you moved home, you did a few things, you joined Don Meets Queely, and then I'm skipping through a few things here, but then you did a bit of corporate training with Mars for a few years. And then your first foray into tech as we would know it about 20 years ago, you went into Microsoft and you ran sales for Microsoft Xbox 360.
That's right. Yeah, it was. I think I joined about a year before 360 was coming to market. Xbox One. I remember some key facts still, melded into my mind from back then. Ireland had the second highest per capita penetration of PlayStation outside of
PlayStations,
Japan.
that's right, yeah.
So we had an extraordinary Sony loyalist marketplace. We were given quite a healthy sales target from Seattle for the Xbox One. But the Xbox 360 was the game changer because it had Xbox Live. And we knew, I guess, at a Microsoft level that the only way you could stay relevant or potentially win the console wars, as they were called, was by moving into the software game where we had the huge advantage over Sony. And very slowly, so it proved to be. Broadband penetration in Ireland when we launched Xbox 360 was 20%. So only 1 in 5 households who potentially wanted to buy Xbox 360 could actually go online.
And this was 2003, 2004, around that time, was it?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Kind of 4 or 5 kind of time. Yeah, absolutely.
So this led to you doing kind of interesting promotional stuff, and you went on to RTE playing Xbox, right?
Yeah. There was this amazing late night gamer show on RTE2 for a while. And all I remember was we had an opportunity to go online and demo Xbox Live with someone in the studio. And it was late, it was 10:30, the show was live, so there was no recording, no editing. And the best place we could find in Dublin that had a kind of a strong broadband connection, for some reason, was the office in Reynards. So I went into Reynards at about 9 p.m. on a Tuesday with my Xbox 360 and my Xbox Live. And somehow it actually all worked. And I played Forza, the driving game, with the host in the studio down the road in Montrose, and it worked.
Jonathan, so yeah. that is a story that we used to tell our editors all the time, that the only place in Dublin with a strong connection was in Reynards, and Absolutely. Several other bars and clubs
that was
around
it.
the
Just
city.
That sweet spot, just the signal in those few streets.
It was so clear, wasn't it?
Absolutely, crystal clear.
So after that, you did a stint in Pepsi. For a few years. Then you joined Brandtone, which people may or may not remember this company. It was an Irish mobile marketing company set up around 2009, 2010, used mobile campaigns with brands, ended up getting backed by Unilever, was flying at one point. You got great experience out of that.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. It is, when I look back with a bit of distance, obviously we didn't get the dream ending. We didn't get the exit, unfortunately.
You were close, though. I mean, this was a company that was valued at around about 100 million.
Yes, and we were in final negotiations with a major global player who was within a signature of doing the deal. And they'd even taken office space in Dublin to manage the the implementation of the deal. And for some reason, as can happen with all these adventures, it didn't quite happen. Mm-hmm. But the 5 years I spent there were probably the most satisfying, challenging, and emotionally rewarding, if not financially rewarding, of my career, because the team of people we had was exceptional. The idea itself was incredible. We had backers, we had money. I think we raised about 40 million between 2011 and 2013, which was a lot back then. We didn't even talk ARR. ARR wasn't really even used as a terminology. We just talked about revenue. We were hitting 20 million revenue with blue chip clients like Unilever, Pepsi, but in markets like India, China, Russia, South Africa, like what used to be called the BRICS or the emerging markets, but these massive fast growth markets where consumerism was beginning to take off at massive scale. And we had a playbook that allowed brands like Unilever win in the market. So it was, between the travel, the culture, and the team of people, it was an amazing experience.
So you were getting a taste at that point for a little bit more of the startup culture, and then you went head first into startup culture after that, because then you went into Money Jar, and that was your own startup, right?
Well, it wasn't mine. I was approached by someone I knew, a CTO who's one of the best in the business around Dublin, who's actually still involved in Money Jar, Johan Reviard. And Johan knew I was kind of kicking my heels around after Brantone and said, you should meet this guy, very smart guy from Belfast with a cool idea. And the guy turned out to be a chap called Kevin Tracy, young guy, much younger than me, but classic entrepreneur. He had a burning ambition to solve a problem for himself and many others like him, which was he wanted to build a neobank to help people save and not spend, to help them, manage all that unnecessary expenditure that was just, getting harder and harder to do. So Money Jar was designed literally that you could put your rent money and your savings money in jars, and you could have friends and family lock the jars for you and prevent you spending them in Reynards or equivalents. So right. It was an amazing idea. It came from the heart. The first time I'd been involved, I came on as a co-founder, as the kind of chief commercial officer. We went around Dublin for 2 years. We raised a lot of money. We were pitching 3-4 times a week. We were a great double act. And then unfortunately, COVID came along just as we were finding our route to market, which I'm very glad to say Money Jar still exists, and it's still pursuing that route to market, which is, helping people in Ireland, but now in Spain as well, get bank accounts where the traditional banking system just won't let them. So it's an incredibly interesting business, and
But for the purposes of your own journey, this added the element of raising money, of pitching, of all of that startup graft that people talk about. That's really, really difficult to learn any other way. And then your next piece before what we're going to end up talking about a little in a minute or two. Finally, you went on to Railsbank.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the one thing I'd learned, one of the many things I guess I'd learned in Money Jar, but I suppose that what was relevant to go into an industry that I'd learned from Money Jar, we'd had to choose a banking as a service platform to build Money Jar on. Obviously, neobanks don't have their own licenses at the beginning. When you're Revolut, you aspire to it, you move there gradually over time, you add your own banking licenses. But a banking license takes a lot of capital, a lot of experience, and a lot of time. So banking as a service is like the AWS of neobanking. So the whole neobanking explosion and fintech explosion was basically built on different platforms, of which Railsbank was probably the leading one at the time. Great bunch of founders who had serious, both deep financial experience, but also entrepreneurial experience with multiple big exits under their belts. So again, when I look back at Brantone versus Railsbank, there was never a moment in Brantone where, the customers were kind of coming through the door, just flooding through the door. That was very much what Railsbank was. We were leading the way. We had things like, direct clearing with the Bank of England. Even people like Stripe were on the phone trying to, piggyback on that for a while they were trying to get their own version of it. So it was an amazing time to see what that hyper growth scaling actually looks like. I think I joined December 22. It was one of the COVID Decembers. I was a remote hire. Didn't get to London for the first time 6 months later. But it was just, I think I was employee number around 300, and they were at 500 by the time I got to London. It was that kind of hyper scaling, and it was global. We were in Singapore, and we were in the US as well. And again, just seeing that level of ambition, that level of growth, that level of potential was amazing. It was a real rocket ship.
So now you've had these couple of decades of business across these industries, across these positions, and these levels of experience. You're now approaching 50. You've left Railsbank. You're around that age. You now decide to step back completely from that. How on earth do you get the idea to become a wine influencer online?
So I think it's a combination of things here. I think firstly, I was casting about for what I'd do next. And I had the luxury of maybe having a couple of years where I could focus on building something rather than having to automatically go straight into something. And that's the first time I'd had that luxury. And I think for the first time I began to tap into my true passion and try and discover, is there a purpose through that passion? So all the time I'd been working in these great companies around the world, wine had always been my passion. Wine, restaurants, that whole hospitality thing. I'd done my what I call WSET exams, levels 1, 2, and 3.
Just explain what that is.
So it's one of the major kind of wine qualifications in the world. It's the Wine and Spirits Educational Trust out of London. So pretty much everyone who's presenting wine to you in a restaurant or in a wine shop will have at least a level 1, level 2. Level 3 is technically sommelier grade qualification. I've never worked as a professional sommelier, but the knowledge has been very helpful in terms of being able
And
to
in
tap in.
simple layman's terms, what would that enable you to explain to me that someone on level 1 or 2 couldn't?
So the real skill of the sommelier, the reason why in France they consider it a métier, it's a profession as worthy as being the chef himself in the kitchen. While the sommelier has an awful lot of functions relating to the operations and profitability of the restaurant, as far as the sommelier's responsibility to the diner is concerned, his role is to help that person find the optimum wine for their taste, their budget, and their knowledge in that moment. So the sommelier is reading somebody. And a lot of people in these situations in restaurants, when the wine list is brought, what I've noticed over my life, I'm one of the few people who doesn't freeze up in that moment. I'm called wine list guy on social media because I love getting a wine list into my hands, because I have enough confidence from my knowledge that I can have a conversation with a sommelier. Most people I observe in restaurants don't have that confidence because they've gone off and not bothered to study wine at that level, which is totally understandable because most people shouldn't be wasting their time studying wine at that level.
Just to be clear, just so I'm familiar with exactly what you're saying, does that mean that if I walked into in front of you, sat down in front of you, that you would be as much sizing me up in terms of what you thought I might like to drink based as much on what I'm wearing or what my haircut is like or the way I spoke or anything like that?
Not necessarily those more kind of obvious visual cues. I think the key to the sommelier is, first of all, putting the guest at ease. It's again, in a lot of these kind of formal fine dining restaurants, and these environments are dying out. This is one of the reasons why I think people don't like being made feel uncomfortable when they're spending a lot of money. But really, a sommelier can very quickly ascertain someone's level of comfort and knowledge with just a couple of casual comments about wine in general. So it may be, like, you may be in a fish restaurant, you may be in a steak restaurant. So the sommelier won't look necessarily at what you're wearing or how you're talking. He'll look at things like the size of your party, who looks like they're in charge, who looks like they have the confidence to engage. But then they're going to try and use food really as a way to learn a little bit about your preferences. So, if it's interesting, certainly in an Irish context, even in fish restaurants, most people still tend to order red wine. So again, culturally, you've all of these local nuances as well. But really, the sommelier isn't there to put you on the spot, make you feel uncomfortable. They're there to really try and help you help yourself. Give them the 1 or 2 data points they need. I'll give you a classic example, because budget is always the thing that terrifies people with sommeliers. Everyone thinks the sommelier is there to upsell, and it's actually the opposite. When you see the champagne trolley coming across the room, that's not the sommelier at work. That's a restaurant's pricing model and upsell model. That's like, just the same as Ryanair, and it works and it's great. That's not what the sommelier is for. The sommelier is there to basically help you determine which varietal, which grape is going to go well. What grapes do you know? What do you know about your wine preferences? Just give me something to work with here. So, sir, do you normally drink red or white? Oh, reds. Oh, what kinds of reds? Would you drink Bordeaux or Malbec or Burgundy? So a sommelier should always start with some really obvious words to look for that recognition in the customer's face, which is it's the start of some confidence. It's oh, I can talk to this person. Yeah. I can have a conversation here, and maybe this person can help me. But my tip always for any diner, it's always great to feel you've anchored the sommelier around your budget early on. So what I always do is I use the wine list and I point to something, but I point to the price point, not the wine. I say, I'm quite interested in something like this, and I circle a price point. And straight away, we're on the same wavelength. And I'm not going to be recommended wines that are 3-4 times outside my budget that make me feel uncomfortable.
So, at what point did you start to take practical action of putting what you thought you might like to do in becoming an online wine influencer into practice?
So the idea was never to become an influencer. The idea was actually I had an ambition to set up a digital marketing agency working with small wine importers, distributors, and retailers in Ireland, of which I know a lot of them as a wine customer. And I would have had conversations with three or four of them. I would have explored, was there an interest there maybe to come up with some form of a digital marketing strategy? My observation, and this isn't unique to the wine business by any means, any subscale independent business massively struggles, not just with traditional marketing, but now with digital marketing. It's just become incredibly difficult to know what to do, and it's very difficult as well to spend money on it because most of what you try doesn't work, and it becomes frustrating. So who do you trust? Who do you listen to? What's the playbook anymore? And that was the problem I'd identified that I thought maybe I could solve.
Mm.
So as part of doing that over about a 3-month period, I realized that I needed to go deeper and understand social media myself as a user, as a brand, not as a voyeur. So I started my account so I could show my clients in our discovery sessions what I was learning about Instagram. I realized Instagram was the right platform for wine businesses. I think it's where their existing and potentially future customer bases are looking for this type of information and discovery. Long story short, the Instagram started taking off with me as the brand, and for reasons I completely understand, none of the wine shops felt that that was the solution they needed to put a contractor in to start running some marketing. And I totally respected that and understood that. And actually, I'm quite glad it didn't happen because I can remain a customer of my favorite wine shops. And now I've ended up somehow becoming a wine influencer through a very backdoor route.
You say modestly, somehow becoming a wine influencer. I mean, you have 48,000 followers on Instagram. You're only, 12, 18 months into it. As I said, you won, a very serious prize in Spain last year, the Wine Sommelier of 2025 at the Vino Influencer Global Awards in Spain. I have two questions for you around the business and the practicality of doing that. The first question is the business end of it. So, how did you approach making money out of it? How do you make money out of this?
So I would have to say at the moment, I am breaking even
Mm.
after about the first 9 months. So there wasn't a huge amount to invest in. So, it's a low cost, low revenue startup. If you think about it that way, it's like a free hit. If you've a bit of money in the bank from your last redundancy, there's enough time there to give it a fair crack of the whip, which is the approach I took. So I spent the first 3 months doing everything myself. I did all the content creation, the editing. I learned how to edit. I learned CapCut. I learned all the tools. And I'm very glad I did because I very quickly came to the realization that my skills, like adding those skills of editing and those more commoditized skills that are widely available through freelancers, that was a poor use of my time and my resources. So I went to my network and I actually got put in touch with a fantastic lady, an Irish girl living in Amsterdam, who has been my social media manager for the last 12 months. So I was spending a bit of money with her every month. We would agree the content. I would create it, send it to her. She would edit it and post it.
Just talk me through that. So, do you put your phone on a tripod
Yeah,
and hit record, and then just send everything to her, and is that how it works roughly?
basically, it's me with my iPhone and my Rode
Yep.
microphone and a pretty crappy little iPod thing I bought.
Mm-hmm.
And I started out by doing lots of interviews in restaurants with restaurant owners and sommeliers. And I would go into the restaurant and literally set this up, and we would do small interviews. Then I would do wine tips just at home in my kitchen in front of my wine fridge. And that was mostly the content for the first 9 or 10 months. It was me recording video that she would turn into reels, and she would know how to do that fast chop editing, create a hook at the start, all of the things you need to stop people scrolling and look at your stuff. Because really, that's what a lot of people, I think, forget when they're consuming social media. They forget how ruthless they are. And when they're creating it, which a lot of people are doing now, they actually maybe forget the point that the first thing you have to achieve is get someone to stop. And the one thing about all of this is, like, I've had reels go viral now. I don't look for virality, because virality isn't a business. It can happen, and it's nice when it does. But if you start trying to become viral, you'll actually come off your content, and you'll ultimately move away from where you're trying to do. I'm trying to build a community of wine lovers who broadly agree with my recommendations and want to hear more of them. If we met, we'd have a lot in common. That's what I'm trying to build out. So then I can talk about what I do, what I like, where I go, knowing that a lot of them will take some value from those tips or insights. If you go chasing virality, you're basically trying to create things that a mass market will like, but very few of them will ever convert into potentially being revenue generating. And that's the other part of your question. So how do you actually generate revenue? You build a community on Instagram, but then you actually have to be able to engage with them more directly through other channels, such as Substacks, newsletters, emails, and ultimately maybe you're trying to sell them mid-funnel content. So I might put up a carousel of 8 slides on Instagram talking about my 4 favorite wine bars in Barcelona, but maybe I will sell my guide to Barcelona for $9.99 through my link tree, or even better still, to my email audience. So it's a classic funnel play. You bring them in at the top with your Instagram, and then you have to whittle them down to the ones who are prepared to pay you small amounts of money for small pieces of content that they value.
And it goes right up to the top, though, doesn't it? Because you do tours now as well, right?
Well, whether that's at the very top or the very bottom, I think it's, I've just launched a few months ago my first tour, and it is in Italy, because I'm a native, like not native, but I'm a fluent Italian speaker from having lived there for 4 years. I've got a fantastic partner on the ground, because I didn't want to set up businesses and become a registered tour guide. I don't need to do that. I'm the host. I guest you on the trip, but we're going to Tuscany for 6 amazing days on the 17th of May. I believe we've a couple of places left if anyone is still interested to get away from that Irish weather. And I'm really looking forward to it, because this is the ultimate, as you say, this is the ultimate funnel conversion. It's people who want to come and spend 6 days with you in real life because they trust your taste and your recommendations.
Yeah. Do you find that some content flies more than other content? Have you found that? And then do you find yourself gravitating a little bit more toward that?
Well, yeah, great question. So yes, I mean, the amazing thing about these platforms is that if you're prepared to spend the time, the analytics that they just serve up to you for free are incredible. Like when I think back to my Pepsi days, the amount of money we were paying to the likes of AC Nielsen for what was pretty dodgy data at the end of the day. I now know more about my audience than I ever knew as a sales director in Pepsi or in Microsoft. So that's the extraordinary piece about this. So if you like data, if you're comfortable with data, yes, is the answer to your question, Adrian. So I know exactly what my best performing stuff is, and usually I can get to a level of insight to understand why. I know everything about my audience. My audience are all over the world, which I find fascinating. As an Irish guy who started this 12, 15 months ago, I find it extraordinary that I have followers literally everywhere. But my biggest market is the US. It's about kind of 25%, followed by the UK. Ireland is only 3rd or 4th. We've South Africa, Australia. Now Instagram has brought in simultaneous translation on a lot of the captions. So now I'm getting Spain, Germany coming into the mix as well, which is fascinating to see how one little technological tweak at their end suddenly opens up a bigger audience for me. It's 63% female. It's 70% 35 to 55. It's very much people who I think associate with what I do, because what I do is what I enjoy doing. I don't act. I'm just myself. I go to places I like. I talk about things I like. But I have to say, if there's one topic in particular, like, you have to know your content pillars. I'm sure it's something you're familiar with from your career. Mine are probably a lot simpler than yours. But my number one content pillar is champagne. It's amazing. Anything I do with champagne usually overperforms, and by quite a bit. Right. My highest performing reel ever, it's had over 2.2 million views. It was me sitting in front of my wine fridge in my kitchen, holding a champagne flute saying you should never drink champagne from a flute. And there's a very good reason for why not. Obviously, people can use whatever they want. They can drink whatever they want and use whatever they want. But if you're spending 70 euros on a bottle of champagne, you should be doing justice to the wine. You should be getting as much pleasure from that wine that you've spent all that money on. A flute effectively pushes the bubbles up your nose, which is why if you ever think to sniff a champagne flute, you don't ever do it again, because you're not sniffing wine, you're sniffing the carbonation. So you should always serve champagne in just a universal white wine glass. There's loads of fancy other glasses you can use. But what's been great is last year, on the back of Instagram getting traction, a few restaurants approached me and we did kind of pop-up wine pairing dinners. So I'd be in Rowley's Bistro or in Marga, RHA, and there'd be typically 30 or 40 guests, and I'd work with the chef. We'd select a food menu, I'd pair wines to it, but I wouldn't just talk about the wines. I would actually give some little tips, such as how to open a bottle properly, or how to, be careful when you're opening champagne. But I would give half a glass of champagne in a flute and half in just a regular white wine glass. And 90% of the time, everyone, when they tried them, were blown away and preferred it from the other glass. So it's amazing when you can put up a piece of content into the cloud, loads of people watch it, loads of people comment on it, but then you meet people in real life and do it in real life and it works. So it's kind of reassuring that when you have the background knowledge, if you put it out there in the right way, the people who want to, find stuff like that out will find you. They'll come to you. So it's quite rewarding.
I think of influencers as breaking their backside, working hard. I see them at events. I know the hours that they put in. And I wonder, in your case, if this is something that you clearly love so much, wine, and you have a passion for it, if you're entering a sphere where to really get ahead and make a living out of it, you may have to put in those hours. Is it possible that it might ruin it for you?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. And I think if that's what it had to become, I think I would try and find a pivot into a slightly different version of this. To be honest, the speed at which the platforms evolve and the algorithms are being changed, the platforms have no responsibility to any of their individual performers, obviously. So at any moment in time, I'm very conscious that my follower growth might just stop, that my engagement might drop, and then suddenly you're less attractive. Like, I'm beginning now to have commercial conversations with luxury hotel groups. I mean, one of the big trends now in luxury hospitality, wine has been identified as one of the experiences that tap into where that kind of, I suppose, upper segment of tourists want to go. They don't just want to have dinner in a restaurant and pick the wine themselves. They potentially want to stay in a winery that has a Michelin star restaurant and a 5-star hotel, and they might spend 5 nights there. And the interesting thing is, the fastest growing revenue line in the whole wine industry, it's not wine, it's actually wine hospitality. So I think from, I guess, my 12 years in startups, and I've been doing mentoring with Enterprise Ireland for 5-6 years as well. The one thing I think you always know is true is, the hard work is half of it, and the right place, right time is usually the other half of it, or some combination of those two things. It does feel to me, with my commercial background, my wine knowledge, my natural love and familiarity with these kinds of nicer destinations, I think I can begin to see my career evolving more into maybe being a host or a guide or an ambassador to some of these corporate clients, rather than just churning out the 3 pieces of content every week for another 10 years. I don't know that the world needs a 60-year-old wine influencer from Ireland. So I think we're going to have to crack the other revenue stream before then.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. Jonathan Staunton, also known as the Wine List Guy, thank you so much for a very illuminating and educational 30 minutes there that you have spent with us about champagne, about flutes, and about many other things in between. Gav Hennessy was on sound on this podcast today, and JJ Clark produced. I'm Adrian Weckler, and you've been listening to or watching The Big Tech Show, and we'll talk to you soon.